Hello and welcome everyone. In this video, we are going to look at some of the global water issues and water issues in rural Alaska. So the main learning objectives in this section are going to be to identify key global water challenges, understand the key elements of the urban water cycle, understand the water food energy nexus, analyze the relationships between water and other global drivers, and discuss some of the roles of policy and governance to address these water issues. So, urban water cycle. Um, First, let's consider the natural water cycle. As you can see in this image here, uh, the water uh, evaporates, forms clouds, and then those clouds have caused precipitation in the form of rain and snow. That water infiltrates into the ground, into the soil, and then further into the ground, in the bedrock, and then the aquifers, and some of that water evapotranspirates, and then the surface runoff goes to the rivers and streams, and then the oceans. So this, in a very crude sense, is the natural water cycle. So when we talk about the urban water cycle, which is of course very different from the natural water cycle, and the urban water cycle, we have water extraction and treatment. First of all, we take water, either groundwater or surface water, and then extract it and then treat it in a water treatment plant. And then that's distributed to industries and residences via a pipe network. And then the used water or the wastewater is collected through a sewer collection system. Um and then that undergoes further treatment, wastewater treatment, before being discharged back into the environment. So overall, uh, this forms the this this forms the urban water cycle, and a lot of the our issues that we're going to talk about or speak about are housed within this context of the urban water cycle. Now let's quickly look at water, the global water quantity. Most of the water, as we know, is in the oceans, and out of the all the water on the earth, there's about 2.5% of fresh water, and of all the fresh water, 68% of that is locked in glaciers and ice caps, and then 30% is groundwater, and 1.3% of the total fresh water is available as surface water and other fresh water. Of that, 70% is logged as ice and snow, 20% in lakes, and then a small percentage in rivers, and then some of it is atmospheric water as well. So we can kind of see that the water that's available is in some ways pretty minuscule. And then, as I said, in the United States, most of the water being used is surface water and a little bit of groundwater, but the use of reclaimed water is also increasing given the water stress. And here you can see the different sectors and their withdrawal and consumption. Agriculture being the dominant sector, it's said agriculture uses about 70% of the total uh, water that's available globally, and then industrial water use is followed by domestic water use. So with all this water, our goal is how to remove the dissolved and particulate constituents from the waters to make it clean water. So we remove those constituents from surface water to make it usable and drinkable. And then once we've used the water, that becomes wastewater. And then again, we have to remove those contaminants to before it can be discharged to be used again further downstream. And then there are several unit processes that we are going to be discussing during this course. Different physical, chemical, biological unit processes, and the idea being that you know a lot of these challenges that an engineer faces, and the solutions to the global water crisis, are they're unlikely to be implemented on a global scale. Water, as a flow resource, it moves through the hydrological cycle across multiple interconnected scales, uh, particularly at the watershed level. And now the majority of the world's population resides in the urban areas, and the rapid population and growth and expansion of cities in the coming decades has makes urban environments critical for addressing water challenges. And the urban areas are not only the major contributor for water pollution, but they are also a major site for water insecurity. So in this course, we're gonna be looking at how water and wastewater solutions can tackle these pressing urban water issues and focusing on strategies to reduce pollution and enhance water security in our growing cities. And these are some of the elements and tools that we are going to be looking at in this course. But before we go there, we're going to consider a few different global water issues that of our times that provide the context in which the engineer of today needs to work in. Okay, so let's first look at water scarcity. About 37% of the global population is living under water scarcity. That's a pretty staggering number, and which is caused by increasing demand for water and dwindling supply of fresh water, particularly in the arid regions and areas that have rapidly growing population, which some of which are sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, which also see severe droughts often. And then there's also the issue of groundwater depletion in high population density regions such as California and parts of India. And so the drivers for these are population growth, urbanization, agricultural overuse, and climate change. And then you can see this map that is showing the water stress globally. And you can see the areas in North America, in Central Europe, in Middle East, in Southeast Asia, and and parts of um, South America. So then we are also facing this climate change, global climate change issue, and its impact on water resources is not often um, identified clearly. But then the rising temperatures and changing precipitation patterns, they also affect water availability and water quality. Glacial melts in the Arctic, the Himalayas, and the Andes, they reduce the long-term water supplies. And the increasing flooding and drought events, they disrupt ecosystems and human settlements. And then wildfires, also linked to increasing incidence of climate change, are they also impact urban water supplies. For example, the recent wildfires in Hawaii and LA, they've had enormous impact on uh, urban water supply and such. Water pollution, it's an ever-present issue where contamination of fresh water source from industrial and agricultural sources and urban waste, fertilizers, uh, fertilizers, they add nitrogen and phosphorus to the downstream water bodies, causing algal blooms and dead zones. In this image, you can see cyanobacterial blooms on Lake Erie, and these harmful algal blooms. Some of these cyanobacterial blooms, they release toxins, microcystins that are very harmful to humans and animals. And then there are other emerging contaminants like microplastics, pharmaceuticals, the perfluorochemicals, the PFAS and the PFOA in drinking water. So all of these lead to ecosystem degradation, loss of biodiversity, and threats to human health. You can see the map in the lower right corner here, which shows all the sites which are contaminated with PFAS. There are numerous sites, military sites, airports, wastewater treatment plants, and industrial facilities. So EPA has recently come up with lots of regulations for PFAS in drinking water. So water pollution in an urban setting. What are the sources of pollution? We can see here residential, industrial, and you can also see a profile view of the groundwater. So there can be agricultural, industrial, and domestic sources of pollution. You can see there are septic tanks which can release some of the contaminants into the aquifer. Then there are industrial effluents that can also impact groundwater. And then the pollutants can be different inorganics like nitrates, phosphates. There can be biological like pathogens or heavy metals. Then there can be detergents or organics and other toxins. So there's a whole range of water pollutants that are sourced from an urban area. Another global issue that we are tackling with is inequitable access to clean water. Millions of people, actually over 2 billion people globally, they still use contaminated water for drinking and cooking. And you can see the schematic on the right here. It says of these 2.1 billion people that lack safe water at home, 263 million of those spend 30 minutes or more round trip collecting water, and about 159 million drink directly from surface sources such as streams or lakes, and 844 million do not have basic drinking water services. So these are figures by the World Health Organization, and there are a lot of the urban slums and rural areas, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, face acute water challenges. These lead to increased disease burden from waterborne illnesses and other contaminants. Another very talked about issue is aging and inadequate water infrastructure. So there's lots of outdated or insufficient infrastructure that leads to water loss, inefficiency, and contamination. There's also incidents of high leakage rates from these aging infrastructure and the urban water supply systems, up to 50% in some developing cities. And US alone has a lot of the water infrastructure is more than 50 to 100 years and beyond its uh, service lifetime, and that needs to be replaced. And many of you might be aware of the Flint water episode and how the community was impacted due to that incident, which was exacerbated by the aging infrastructure, which was at the core of the whole episode. And so in the next coming decades, a lot of this infrastructure needs to be replaced, but the funding for that is hard to come by. And then there's also, because of this inadequate water infrastructure, untreated wastewater discharge happens in rivers and lakes across the world. Then there's another issue which is more global in nature, is the transboundary water conflicts, which is disputes over shared water resources, especially in regions with limited agreements. And some of the examples include the Nile River dispute between Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan, especially the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which Ethiopia is building, would hinder access to water supply for Egypt and Sudan. That's been a big point of contention, and similarly the Mekong River in Southeast Asia. So there are several such transboundary water conflicts you can look at. The schematic on the right. Many of these issues they have increased in the last couple of decades. Asia has a lot of these issues. Lots a lot of people there, so that makes these issues more I guess more strife associated with these water sharing agreements. And then Africa, and then Latin America and the Caribbean, and so forth. So the key for a lot of these transboundary conflicts is to how the different stakeholders are able to balance their national interests and with cooperative management. It's some of these are like decade-long issues, and it's not easy to solve them. It needs a lot of uh, policy and diplomacy. Water and food security. Water and food security are very closely linked. In fact, agriculture accounts for, as you've already seen, accounts for about 70% or more of global freshwater withdrawal. So agriculture is the biggest water user. And then also there's also room for improvements because high water losses occur due to outdated irrigation methods such as flood irrigation, and a lot of and so much of this water use has led to depleting of aquifers in key agricultural regions such as India, and then especially some of the northern states, and then also the Ogallala Aquifer in the U.S. In the Great Plains area. So with these decreasing and depleting aquifers, that could impact crop yields, that could lead to food supply shortages, which could lead to rising food prices. So it's a ripple effect that the water availability or uh, water quantity might have on the food and food prices. So there are some solutions that are also being worked on in this regard, such as effective irrigation practices like drip irrigation, drought-resistant and water-efficient crops, water recycling and reuse in agriculture to be more efficient in using water. And therefore there is this whole Nexus approach, which has the hypothesis is that the water, food, and energy, they are not individual sectors working in silos. In fact, there are ways to leverage synergies. It's not a zero-sum game. There are ways to leverage synergies so that it can impact efficiencies in food, water, and energy because of their interconnectedness in these systems. So there's been a lot of work looking at those synergies and efficiencies and the connections between the three sectors. Next is waterborne diseases, which overall there has been a lot of improvement, especially in the US, with regards to waterborne diseases or other developed countries with proper disinfection, but still poor water quality and sanitation on a global level still contribute to a significant spread of diseases. For example, cholera outbreaks in regions with poor sanitation, such as Haiti. And then there are also malaria and dengue proliferation due to stagnant water in urban areas, especially more in the tropical climates. In the US, also, there has been noted Legionella rise in the last couple of decades. This plot you can see from 2000 to 2021, it's been a pretty steady increase. And some of these are associated with warmer temperatures, even for the buried pipelines. Cyanobacterial proliferation due to climate change in warmer waters and harmful algal blooms is also associated with increasing the waterborne illnesses. And there are a lot of other pathogenic microorganisms which are on the rise due to reasons of warmer waters and climate change. Okay, urban water management. Talking of this, as we discuss, that as more and more people move into urban regions globally, that creates challenges in managing water supply and wastewater in these densely populated regions. Leads to increased water demand, water pollution, and overburdened stormwater systems. So the rapid population growth in urban areas that intensifies demand in drinking water because there's so many people concentrated in a smaller land area that population density requires more drinking water facilities, more sanitation, more industrial uses, and the supply it often falls short. and the requirement, they outpace the available resources. And then with all this population, there's also the urban runoff that carries all kinds of pollutants like oil, heavy metals, sewage, organics, pharmaceuticals into the water bodies nearby, which degrades the water quality and increases treatment costs. And these large megacities leads to water shortages, like what happened in Cape Town, South Africa. During 2015 to 18, Cape Town had a prolonged drought, which led Cape Town to the brink of water shut off, as you can see in the bottom right plot of the water availability, or the water stored in the dam that supplies water to the city of Cape Town. The stored water levels dwindled and dwindled, and the predicted day was May 20th in 2018, known as day zero, when the supply would be completely shut off. And there was a massive effort across the city, across the population, to lower their water usage, to make their water consumption more efficient. As you can see from these schematics, let's be day zero with 50 liters or less per day per person, and its recommendations like how to divvy up that 50-liter quota per person. And then actually, by a lot of these efforts, Cape Town was able to push off day zero into 2019 and beyond, and by that time the levels in the storage water did recover, and the situation was averted. But it's not out of question that these kinds of situations become more and more common in other cities and other big urban cities across the globe. There's also been a push towards privatization and water pricing, uh, according to privatization. So historically speaking, water is considered as uh, uh, a government supplied entity because it's a basic human resource, so that's something that should be afforded by the governments and not be operated by private owners. But then privatization has its benefits. It can attract investment for upgrading infrastructure, improving efficiency, especially where public resources are limited. But then privately owned systems, they also tend to have higher annual bills, and which leads to lower affordability for customers, especially for low-income communities. So this leads to conversation on environmental justice and those ramifications. And there has been a lot of resistance in privatization in certain countries like Bolivia. And then there are stringent regulations uh, coming up for example, for PFAS, which would mean more treatment and higher costs. That would finally, those costs would trickle down to the consumers and make water even more expensive. A recent study by Zhang et al. In 2022, they looked at different factors that lead to higher prices in the US cities and factors that lead to low water affordability for low-income families. And private water ownership was a feature in both of them. That means that private water ownership leads to higher prices and also leads to less affordability for low-income families. So it's still an ongoing issue and an ongoing debate. One of the final global issues that we're going to look at is the oceanic issues related to water systems. Ocean acidification, that we have talked about before in the previous courses, is it's a process by which the ocean's pH decreases. That means the acidity increases due to absorption of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And this schematic here shows how the carbon dioxide that equilibrates from the atmosphere to the marine water, forming carbonic acid, and that dissociates to form carbonate and bicarbonate ion, and those can take up calcium and reduce the calcium content in the marine waters, which leads to coral bleaching and loss of marine biodiversity. So it's a worrisome issue that's being looked at, but it's a direct consequence of increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Marine pollution, on the other hand, is basically a lot of waste that's accumulating in the oceans, coming from these large developed human settlements across the globe. Then there's also agricultural runoff carrying fertilizers and pesticides, which leads to eutrophication, harmful algal blooms, dead zones, and bioaccumulation of these toxins in marine life. So it's a trickle-down effect that all that pollution, that all that contamination and pollutant that have been created, that ends up a lot of times in the oceans. Another less talked about issue is the salinization of coastal aquifers. There's a lot of aquifers near the coasts. They are becoming more and more salinized due to sea level rise, which makes it harder to use them for water use and water consumption. Now let's pivot and discuss some of the rural Alaska water and wastewater challenges. Just a little bit of a background, which many of you might be aware. Alaska is home to 250 native communities and constitutes about 25% or slightly under 25% of the state's population. And these images are showing some of those communities and the native regions in the state. And geologically speaking, most of Alaska is underlain by continuous or discontinuous permafrost. You can see the northern part is underlain by continuous, and the central part of the state is underlain by discontinuous permafrost. Permafrost is a ground that is completely and continuously frozen for 2 years or more. So how does that impact water supply, water sources? It creates logistical challenges for water and sanitation systems in rural Alaska. Soils are not amenable to be buried. That leads to very expensive, high expense to build and operate water systems. Also, water needs to be circulated to keep from freezing. That adds to that cost. And then the transportation of water or sewage long distances. So a lot of these factors come together and make water and sanitation very difficult in rural Alaska. These are some images taken by my collaborators for a project that we're working on for water and sanitation in rural Alaska communities. Now, broadly speaking, you can divide the water and sanitation services in 4 categories. First are the piped systems that provide water directly to homes from a centralized source through pipes. And then there's closed haul, where trailers, they're pulled by 4-wheelers or snow machines that are used to deliver potable water, and they remove sewage. Then there are washaterias, which are centralized facilities for obtaining treated water, showering, and doing laundry. So these are like washaterias are community-wide facilities that are present in many communities. And then finally, the least on the scale is self-haul or unserved communities, where the residents themselves haul their water, sometimes from the washaterias, and they store it in their homes, and then they haul the waste from their homes into the nearby lagoons. So these are categorized as unserved homes or unserved communities, which we'll talk about more in a moment. So the unserved homes and unserved communities, if you look in the boxes on the top right, an unserved home is one which is not connected to an on-site or community piped or closed haul system. And it's estimated that there are about 6,000 unserved homes in the state of Alaska. An unserved community is one which has more than 45% of homes that are unserved. There are about 30 unserved communities out of the 250. Now there are these, out of these 6,000 unserved homes, 70% of those are in unserved communities, but 30% are in served communities. So just different ways of categorizing these unserved homes and communities. And then some of these unserved homes are unserviceable, meaning that they don't have septic tanks and wells are not feasible due to the ground conditions. They're far from the core community to provide piped or haul services. So, but for the others, that can be serviced, some of them have been funded but not yet connected, and then others are not even funded yet and not connected. So These numbers, I should mention, these are a bit dated, and there's not immediate information of how these have changed, but there's a wide, uh, I think, understanding that these have not improved a lot in the last decade or so. And then this also shows further the dire states. The estimated costs and budget needs have just increased and increased, but the funding from all sources has fallen short. However, in the recent times, the infrastructure bill did help shorten that gap a little bit, but still the gap does exist. And here you can further see the homeowner costs for water and wastewater in rural Alaska. The y-axis is the water and wastewater user fee as a percentage of monthly household income. And here it's showing, the green line shows the lower 48 average, which is about 1% of the monthly household income. But for rural Alaska, it exceeds 5 to 6% pretty commonly here. You can see many of these are close to 6.5 to 7%. And EPA recommends sustainability threshold is at 5%. Some of the larger cities like Juneau, Anchorage, Sitka, Palmer, they are around what the lower 48 average is, but many of these rural communities still face a huge gap. And this higher cost of water and wastewater leads to low water use in Alaska. And it's been observed that self-haul people have about 1 to 5 gallons per capita per day is the water use. For trucked haul, it increases to 5 to 30 gallons per capita per day. For piped Arctic systems, it's more 40 to 60 gallons per capita per day. And then you can see the WHO recommendations that recommend about 25 or 26.4 to be precise gallons per capita per day for optimal access and low levels of health concern. So with self-haul and trucked haul, you're barely meeting those. With self-haul, you're not at all meeting those, but with trucked haul, you're barely meeting those levels recommended by the WHO. And then the recent study by Mattis et al. 2020, they found that 80% of the participating households in 2 rural communities, 2 remote and unserved communities that they studied, they reported reusing the wash basin water, like in this bowl here, an average of 3 times before changing the water. From a study conducted by me and some of my students, we looked at the per capita yearly total energy consumption in kilowatt hour. And you can see that the communities, we looked at 73 odd communities, and the continental US average is much lower than what the rural Alaska average is. And this on the x-axis, you can see it's increasing. The communities are grouped by increasing population. The lower the population, generally speaking, the higher the energy consumption per capita, which indicates to economies of scale, which is also an issue overall. But we can see 3 to 4 times higher energy requirement in rural Alaska, and 3 to 5 times high energy costs are also a reality. And if you combine the two of them, it leads to about 10 to 20 times higher water costs in rural Alaska. So overall, from looking at all of these global issues and local issues for Alaska, what's the role of environmental engineers? Well, environmental engineers of today, they operate at a localized scale within the context of global and regional water issues. While we are not directly involved in policy development, the work often intersects with and does influence policy decisions. So it's imperative that engineers are well aware and grounded in the context of a lot of these issues, because that's what their work is gonna be based on. And water and wastewater engineering they're intrinsically linked to human health and public welfare. So ensuring clean drinking water and safe sanitation systems, it places a profound responsibility on the engineers to protect and enhance the quality of life. So I think it goes without saying that this profession, is highly rewarding. It's one of public service and protecting human health. So all the efforts that we spend learning the engineering and the techniques and the innovations behind, in our work, that's going to directly help uh, the global population in one way or another. So with that, I'm gonna stop for this lecture, and then looking forward to see you in the next lecture.